On the night of August 21st, 1942, at 11:57 p.m., Captain John Hightower crouched behind a muddy ridge on Guadalcanal, watching shadows move through the jungle mist 200 yards away. The humid air carried the sound of rustling leaves and distant whispers in Japanese, while steam rose from the rain-soaked ground around his 37mm anti-tank gun. At 31 years old, Hightower was a Marine artillery officer who had spent months perfecting a weapon that wasn't supposed to kill men at all. It was built to punch through tank armor. His gunner, Sergeant Eddie McCullough, checked the breech one more time, loading what looked like an ordinary artillery shell, but contained something the Japanese had never seen before. 122 steel balls, each the size of a marble, packed tight and ready to scatter like buckshot from hell. For months, the Japanese had terrified American forces across the Pacific with their Banzai charges, human waves of screaming soldiers rushing forward with bayonets fixed, overwhelming enemies through sheer numbers and fanatical courage. Every Marine on Guadalcanal had heard the stories. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging at once, unstoppable, willing to die for their emperor, turning battles into nightmares of hand-to-hand combat where superior firepower meant nothing. The tactic had worked from China to the Philippines, breaking enemy lines and shattering morale with its brutal simplicity. Tonight, over 1,000 Japanese soldiers from the 17th Infantry Division were preparing to launch the largest Banzai charge Guadalcanal had ever seen, confident that their traditional strategy would sweep the Americans into the sea. But Hightower's gun wasn't loaded with the armor-piercing rounds it was designed to fire. Instead, McCullough had chambered an M2 canister round, a tank killer turned into the deadliest shotgun ever created. When that shell left the barrel, it would explode at the muzzle and release a cone of steel death that could shred everything in a 200-yard fan. The Japanese soldiers charging across that jungle clearing had no idea they were about to meet a weapon that would turn their greatest strength into their most fatal weakness. The first reports of Japanese movement came at 1800 hours on August 21st, when Marine scouts positioned along the Lunga River spotted enemy soldiers massing in the dense jungle west of Henderson Field. Captain Hightower received the intelligence while cleaning his 37mm gun, the metal still warm from the afternoon's test firing. The message was brief but alarming. Enemy forces estimated at battalion strength, possibly larger, moving east toward American defensive positions under cover of approaching darkness. General Harukichi Hyakutake had spent 3 weeks planning this assault from his command post in the hills above the Matanikau River. His 17th Infantry Division had been bleeding men and supplies since the Americans landed on Guadalcanal 6 weeks earlier, and the situation was becoming desperate. Japanese supply convoys could only reach the island at night, racing down the slot under cover of darkness, while American bombers patrolled during daylight hours. His soldiers were reduced to half rations, many suffering from malaria and dysentery, but Hyakutake knew that a successful breakthrough could change everything. If his men could overrun the American positions and recapture Henderson Field, Japanese aircraft could return to the island and tip the balance of the entire Solomon Islands campaign. The Banzai charge was not born from desperation alone. It was rooted in centuries of samurai tradition and modern military doctrine that emphasized spiritual strength over material advantage. Japanese infantry training taught soldiers that determined assault could overcome any defensive position, that the emperor's divine blessing made victory inevitable if men fought with proper spirit. From Nanking to Manila, these human wave attacks had shattered enemy lines and broken the will of defenders who could not match Japanese fanaticism. Hyakutake's officers reported that American Marines were brave fighters, but had never faced a full-scale Banzai assault, and the general believed that 1,000 screaming soldiers charging through the jungle night would scatter the defenders like leaves in a typhoon. Lieutenant Kenji Okada briefed his company commanders as rain began falling through the jungle canopy, turning the ground beneath their feet into black mud. His men crouched in the undergrowth, bayonets already fixed to their Arisaka rifles, faces painted with charcoal to blend with the darkness. Each soldier carried minimal equipment, rifle, bayonet, 2 grenades, and enough ammunition for the initial assault. Speed and shock were everything. Once they broke through the American perimeter, they would use captured weapons to complete the destruction. Okada had fought in China, where similar tactics crushed Chinese nationalist forces, watching entire divisions flee before the terrifying sight of Japanese infantry charging with fixed bayonets and battle cries that echoed across the battlefield. Marine defensive positions stretched along a ridge overlooking the jungle approaches, with interlocking fields of fire carefully planned to channel any attack into killing zones. Captain Hightower positioned his gun crew at the center of this line, where the terrain funneled approaches through a natural clearing approximately 150 yards wide. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun had been designed to destroy Japanese light tanks and armored vehicles, but those targets rarely appeared in the thick jungle terrain of Guadalcanal. Instead, Hightower had spent weeks experimenting with M2 canister rounds, turning his tank killer into something far more devastating for infantry combat. Each canister round contained 122 steel balls, precisely machined to .38 caliber, and packed in a thin metal casing that would rupture at the gun's muzzle. When fired, the round created a cone of metal projectiles spreading outward like an enormous shotgun blast, effective against massed infantry at ranges up to 250 yards. The weapon's direct fire capability meant gunners could see their targets and adjust aim accordingly, unlike mortars or artillery that required forward observers and radio coordination. For stopping human wave attacks, nothing in the American arsenal matched its combination of mobility, accuracy, and devastating firepower. Sergeant McCullough had trained his crew until they could load and fire in darkness, working by feel and muscle memory developed through countless hours of drill. The gun weighed only 900 pounds, light enough for 6 men to manhandle into position quickly, yet sturdy enough to absorb the shock of rapid fire without losing accuracy. Private Miller served as loader, responsible for chambering rounds and maintaining ammunition supply during combat. The crew had fired practice rounds at wooden targets placed at various ranges, watching the steel balls tear through simulated enemy formations with surgical precision. As midnight approached, the sounds of the jungle changed subtly. Birds stopped calling, insects fell silent, and even the constant drip of moisture from overhead branches seemed to pause. Marines along the defensive line checked their weapons one final time, peering into the darkness through iron sights and telescopic scopes. Machine gun crews tested their traverse and elevation mechanisms, ensuring smooth operation when the shooting started. Mortar teams calculated ranges to predetermine targets, while riflemen counted ammunition and made final adjustments to their positions. Japanese soldiers began their approach at 0-115 hours, moving through the jungle with practiced stealth despite their numbers. Officers whispered commands as companies deployed into assault formation, spreading across a front nearly half a mile wide to maximize the psychological impact of their charge. The plan called for simultaneous attacks at multiple points along the American line, preventing defenders from concentrating fire and creating confusion that Japanese follow-up forces could exploit. Okada positioned his company at the center of the assault, directly opposite Captain Hightower's gun position, though neither man knew of the other's presence in the darkness. The first indication of the coming storm was a low rumbling sound that gradually resolved into hundreds of voices chanting in Japanese, growing louder as enemy soldiers worked themselves into the psychological state necessary for their suicidal charge. American sentries reported movement across their entire front, with enemy soldiers visible as dark shapes moving between the trees, no longer attempting concealment. The time for stealth had passed. Now came the moment when spiritual strength would meet American steel, when centuries of samurai tradition would collide with modern military technology in a test that would determine the fate of Guadalcanal and possibly the entire Pacific War. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun had arrived at Guadalcanal 3 months earlier, shipped from the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, where engineers had designed it specifically to penetrate the armor of Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tanks. The weapon featured a semi-automatic breech mechanism that could fire 15 rounds per minute in the hands of a trained crew, with an effective range against armored targets of 1,000 yards. Its 3-inch bore could punch through 25 millimeters of steel at 500 yards using standard armor-piercing ammunition, making it more than adequate for destroying the thin-skinned Japanese tanks encountered in the Pacific Theater. Captain Hightower had first encountered the M2 canister round during training exercises at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where instructors demonstrated its effectiveness against simulated infantry attacks. The round measured exactly 3 inches in diameter and 4.7 inches in length, weighing 2 pounds and containing its deadly cargo of steel balls in a precisely engineered metal case. When fired, the round traveled approximately 50 feet before a timed fuse triggered the casing to rupture, releasing its contents in a cone that spread to 30 yards wide at maximum effective range. Each steel ball weighed approximately 1/3 of an ounce and traveled at nearly 1,500 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to penetrate human flesh and bone with devastating effect. The engineering behind the canister round represented a return to principles used in 18th century warfare when artillery crews loaded their cannons with grape shot to break up massed infantry attacks. American ordnance specialists had studied historical accounts of canister effectiveness during the Civil War, particularly at battles like Gettysburg, where Union artillery decimated Confederate charges across open ground. The M2 round improved upon these earlier designs by using precisely manufactured steel balls instead of irregular iron fragments, ensuring consistent ballistics and maximum dispersion pattern. Quality control at the manufacturing facility in Detroit required each steel ball to meet tolerances of plus or minus 0.02 of an inch, guaranteeing uniform flight characteristics when fired. Sergeant McCullough understood the weapon's capabilities better than most, having served as an artillery instructor before shipping out to the Pacific. He had calculated that a single canister round fired into a formation of soldiers spaced 6 feet apart could disable or kill every man within a 60-yard frontal area, assuming optimal range and elevation. The steel balls maintained lethal velocity out to 200 yards, though accuracy decreased significantly beyond 150 yards due to atmospheric drag and gravitational drop. For maximum effectiveness against human targets, McCullough preferred to engage at ranges between 75 and 125 yards, where the cone of projectiles remained tightly concentrated while still covering a substantial area. The gun's direct fire capability gave it significant advantages over mortars and howitzers when engaging visible targets. Unlike indirect fire weapons that required complex calculations and forward observers to adjust impact points, the M3 allowed gunners to aim directly at their targets using optical sights mounted above the barrel. The sight assembly included range markings calibrated for both armor-piercing and canister ammunition, with windage and elevation adjustments that could be made quickly during combat. In daylight conditions, experienced gunners could place rounds within 3 yards of their aim point at ranges up to 300 yards, though nighttime accuracy decreased substantially without artificial illumination. Private Miller had memorized the loading sequence until he could perform it blindfolded, a skill that would prove essential in the chaos of night combat. Each canister round weighed exactly 2 pounds, requiring careful handling to avoid damaging the thin metal casing that contained the steel balls. The semi-automatic breech opened with a sharp metallic clang when fired, ejecting the spent cartridge case and allowing immediate insertion of the next round. Miller could maintain a firing rate of 12 rounds per minute during sustained combat, though the crew usually fired in bursts of 3 to 5 rounds to avoid overheating the barrel and depleting ammunition too quickly. The ammunition supply presented logistical challenges that had concerned Captain Hightower since arriving on Guadalcanal. Each gun position maintained 50 rounds of mixed ammunition, with 30 canister rounds and 20 armor-piercing shells stored in waterproof containers buried near the firing position. Resupply during combat required runners to carry individual rounds from ammunition dumps located 200 yards behind the front lines, a dangerous task when enemy fire swept the intervening ground. The weight and bulk of 37mm ammunition meant that each Marine could carry only 2 rounds at a time, making sustained fire dependent upon careful ammunition management and accurate shooting. Japanese intelligence had failed to identify the presence of anti-tank guns in American defensive positions, focusing instead on machine gun nests and mortar locations that posed more obvious threats to infantry assault. Enemy reconnaissance patrols had observed Marines digging positions along the ridge, but had not detected the carefully camouflaged 37mm guns positioned to cover the most likely approaches. General Hyakutake's battle plan assumed that his soldiers would face rifle fire and light machine guns during their charge, threats that could be overcome through speed and determination. The devastating firepower of canister rounds had not entered Japanese tactical calculations. The gun crew had practiced their firing drill countless times during the weeks leading up to the attack, working to achieve the split-second timing that would be essential when hundreds of enemy soldiers emerged from the jungle simultaneously. McCullough served as gunner, responsible for aiming and firing, while Miller loaded ammunition and maintained communication with the ammunition bearers. 2 additional Marines served as ammunition carriers, positioned in a shallow trench, 10 yards behind the gun, where they could observe the tactical situation and move rounds forward as needed. A 5th crew member operated a sound-powered telephone connected to Captain Hightower's command post, allowing coordination with other weapons and calling for artillery support when required. The weapon's most significant limitation lay in its inability to fire over obstacles or provide indirect support to distant positions. Unlike mortars that could lob shells over hills and trees, the 37mm gun required clear lines of sight to engage targets effectively. This restriction meant that Japanese soldiers who reached dead space close to American positions could advance without fear of canister fire, making the weapon most effective when integrated with other defensive systems. Captain Hightower had positioned his guns to cover open ground, where enemy soldiers would be forced to expose themselves during their assault, while machine guns and rifles covered areas where the anti-tank guns could not engage. As the Japanese chanting grew louder in the darkness ahead, McCulloch made final adjustments to his gun's elevation and traverse mechanisms, ensuring smooth operation when the shooting began. The first canister round rested in the breech, ready to fire, while Miller crouched beside a stack of additional ammunition with his loading gloves already in place. Captain Hightower moved between gun positions, checking communications and confirming that each crew understood their sector of responsibility. The weapon that had been designed to destroy tanks was about to face its greatest test against an enemy that believed spiritual strength could overcome any material advantage. At 0:47 hours, Lieutenant Okada raised his sword and screamed the traditional battle cry that echoed across the jungle clearing. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers erupted from the tree line simultaneously, their voices joining in a terrifying chorus that had broken enemy formations from Manchuria to the Philippines. The sound rolled across the dark landscape like thunder, a primal roar of men who had accepted death and sought only to take as many enemies with them as possible. Bayonets glinted in the dim starlight as the human waves surged forward, boots splashing through mud and shallow streams that crossed the approach to the American positions. Captain Hightower watched the assault develop through his binoculars, counting enemy soldiers as they poured out of the jungle in seemingly endless numbers. The Japanese had deployed in a formation 300 yards wide and 20 ranks deep, with officers positioned throughout the mass to maintain direction and momentum during the charge. Soldiers in the front ranks carried rifles with fixed bayonets, while those behind brandished swords, grenades, and even sharpened bamboo stakes. The sheer scale of the attack exceeded American intelligence estimates by nearly 50%, representing the largest concentration of enemy infantry yet encountered on Guadalcanal. Sergeant McCulloch tracked the advancing mass through his gun sight, waiting for the enemy to reach the predetermined engagement range of 125 yards. Japanese soldiers stumbled and fell in the darkness, but continued forward without pause, trampling their own wounded in their desperate rush toward the Marine positions. The front rank had covered nearly half the distance to the American line when McCulloch placed his finger on the trigger and began his final aiming sequence, adjusting elevation to account for the slight downward slope of the terrain. The lead Japanese soldiers were screaming individual words now, their voices hoarse from the sustained battle cry, but their momentum undiminished. Lieutenant Okada ran among his men, sword raised above his head, urging them forward even as machine gun fire began crackling from American positions along the ridge. Red tracers streaked through the darkness, cutting down enemy soldiers in the front ranks, but the sheer numbers meant that gaps closed immediately as following waves pressed forward over the bodies of the fallen. At exactly 120 yards range, McCulloch squeezed the trigger and felt the 37mm gun slam backward against its recoil mechanism. The muzzle flash illuminated the jungle clearing for an instant, revealing hundreds of enemy faces twisted with battle fury, before the canister round exploded 50 feet from the barrel and released its deadly cargo. 122 steel balls spread outward in a cone of destruction, each projectile traveling at 1,500 feet per second toward the densely packed formation of charging soldiers. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Japanese soldiers in the center of the assault formation simply disappeared, cut down by multiple steel balls that tore through flesh and bone with devastating efficiency. Men who had been running at full speed collapsed mid-stride, their forward momentum carrying them several more yards before they crashed into the mud. The cone of destruction carved a gap 30 yards wide in the front rank, leaving a swath of dead and dying soldiers scattered across the jungle floor like broken dolls. Private Miller already had the second canister round ready, slamming it into the breech as the spent cartridge case clattered to the ground beside the gun position. The semi-automatic mechanism cycled smoothly, allowing McCulloch to adjust his aim slightly to the left, where Japanese soldiers continued their advance, despite the carnage around them. The second round fired 8 seconds after the first, its steel balls sweeping through another section of the assault formation and adding dozens more casualties to the growing pile of bodies. Lieutenant Okada felt the concussion of the first canister round as steel balls whistled past his head, one projectile close enough to tear through his uniform sleeve without touching skin. He watched in disbelief as entire sections of his company vanished in clouds of blood and torn flesh, the precise formations he had spent weeks training dissolving into chaos within seconds. Soldiers who had survived the initial barrage stumbled forward in shock, stepping over the mangled remains of their comrades while trying to maintain their charge toward the American positions. The third canister round caught a group of Japanese soldiers who had bunched together while navigating around their fallen comrades, the steel balls striking with such force that some men were lifted off their feet before crashing back to earth. McCullough was firing now with mechanical precision, adjusting his aim between shots to cover different sections of the assault formation while Miller maintained a steady supply of ammunition. The gun's semi-automatic breech allowed sustained fire at a rate that devastated the tightly packed enemy formation. Other Marine positions along the ridge opened fire with rifles, machine guns, and mortars, adding to the destruction already wrought by the canister rounds. Japanese soldiers who had survived the steel ball barrages found themselves caught in interlocking fields of rifle fire that cut down anyone who remained standing. The carefully planned assault that was supposed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers had become a slaughter, with enemy casualties mounting by the second while the survivors pressed forward with diminishing hope of success. General Hyakutake observed the battle from his command post 2 miles away, watching muzzle flashes illuminate the jungle clearing and listening to the sounds of combat that told him his assault was failing catastrophically. Radio communications with Lieutenant Okada's company had ceased after the first few minutes of the attack, suggesting that his officers were dead or too busy fighting for survival to maintain contact with headquarters. The sustained volume of American fire indicated defensive preparations far more extensive than Japanese intelligence had suggested. McCullough fired his 7th canister round into a group of Japanese soldiers who had managed to advance, within 70 yards of the Marine positions, the close range allowing the steel balls to maintain maximum velocity and concentration. The devastation at this distance was complete, with individual projectiles possessing enough energy to pass completely through human bodies and strike multiple targets. Enemy soldiers caught in the cone of fire were torn apart so thoroughly that identification of individual casualties became impossible. The Japanese assault began to falter as soldiers in the rear ranks encountered the growing field of casualties that blocked their path forward. Men who had started the charge with absolute confidence in victory now faced the reality of American firepower that exceeded anything they had experienced in previous campaigns. The spiritual strength that was supposed to overcome material disadvantage proved insufficient against weapons designed specifically to destroy massed infantry formations. Lieutenant Okada lay dying in the mud 30 yards from the Marine positions, his sword still clutched in his right hand, but his body pierced by multiple steel balls that had shredded his internal organs. Around him, the remnants of his company continued their advance on hands and knees, some men crawling forward despite wounds that would prove fatal within minutes. The Banzai charge that was supposed to break American morale had instead demonstrated the futility of human courage against modern military technology, leaving nearly 800 Japanese soldiers dead or wounded in a clearing that had become a killing field beyond imagination. Dawn revealed the full extent of the carnage across the jungle clearing, where 783 Japanese bodies lay scattered in patterns that traced the deadly arcs of canister fire. Marine burial details worked methodically through the field of corpses, counting casualties and collecting intelligence materials while trying not to look too closely at what the steel balls had done to human flesh. Captain Hightower walked among the dead, studying the effectiveness of his weapon and making mental notes for future engagements. The canister rounds had performed exactly as designed, creating overlapping zones of destruction that no infantry formation could survive. General Hyakutake received the casualty reports at his command post as the morning sun climbed above the jungle canopy, the numbers confirming his worst fears about the failed assault. 3 entire companies had been effectively destroyed, with only 47 survivors from Lieutenant Okada's unit managing to retreat back to Japanese lines. The few wounded soldiers who could still speak described weapons unlike anything they had encountered in China or the Philippines, artillery pieces that fired clouds of metal balls capable of cutting down dozens of men with each shot. The psychological impact on surviving troops proved as devastating as the physical casualties, with entire platoons refusing orders to advance when they learned about the fate of their comrades. Marine intelligence officers interrogated captured Japanese soldiers throughout the following week, documenting their reactions to the canister fire and its effect on enemy morale. Sergeant Yamamoto, wounded by steel ball fragments in his left shoulder and thigh, described the horror of watching his squad leader disintegrate in front of him as multiple projectiles struck simultaneously. The prisoner explained that Japanese training had prepared soldiers to face rifle bullets and machine gun fire, but nothing in their experience had suggested the possibility of weapons that could kill so many men so quickly across such a wide area. Word of the new American weapon spread rapidly through Japanese units throughout the Solomon Islands. carried by survivors of subsequent encounters who described similar devastation at Edson's Ridge 3 weeks later. The 9th Company of the 3rd Battalion encountered canister fire while attempting to assault Marine positions on September 13th, losing 112 men in less than 2 minutes when 3 37mm guns opened fire simultaneously. Japanese soldiers who had previously shown no fear in combat began exhibiting symptoms of what American medical personnel recognized as battle fatigue, refusing to advance across open ground where the deadly artillery might be waiting. Captain Hightower submitted detailed after-action reports to Marine Corps headquarters, documenting the tactical employment of canister rounds and recommending modifications to standard infantry tactics. His analysis showed that a single 37mm gun firing canister ammunition could stop an infantry company-sized assault if positioned properly and supplied with adequate ammunition. The weapon's effectiveness increased dramatically when multiple guns coordinated their fire, creating overlapping fields of destruction that left no gaps for enemy soldiers to exploit during their advance. The success at Guadalcanal led to immediate changes in Marine Corps doctrine regarding anti-tank gun employment in the Pacific Theater. Training manuals published in October 1942 included new sections on canister ammunition usage, with detailed diagrams showing optimal firing positions and engagement ranges for different tactical situations. Artillery schools at Camp Lejeune and Quantico began incorporating anti-personnel training into their curricula, teaching gunners to calculate dispersion patterns and select appropriate ammunition types based on target characteristics. Japanese commanders attempted to adapt their tactics to counter the devastating effectiveness of canister rounds, but their options remained limited by terrain and the fundamental nature of their assault doctrine. General Hyakutake experimented with night infiltration attacks using smaller groups of soldiers, but these tactics proved ineffective against Marine defensive positions equipped with flares and searchlights. Attempts to suppress American artillery positions with mortar fire failed because the mobile 37mm guns could be repositioned quickly between firing missions. The psychological warfare value of canister ammunition became apparent during subsequent battles on Tarawa and Saipan, where Japanese soldiers displayed increasing reluctance to participate in Banzai charges after hearing accounts from Guadalcanal survivors. American intelligence reports noted a significant decrease in the frequency and intensity of Japanese human wave attacks beginning in early 1943, tactical innovations that had fundamentally altered the nature of Pacific warfare. But Hightower never spoke publicly about his role in developing canister tactics. He accepted a teaching position at the Marine Corps Artillery School, where he spent the remainder of his military career training the next generation of gunners in the lessons learned from 3 years of jungle fighting. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun achieved a combat record that far exceeded its original design specifications, serving in every major Pacific campaign from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Total production reached 4,800 units by war's end, with over 2 million canister rounds manufactured at arsenals throughout the United States. The weapon's versatility in both anti-tank and anti-personnel roles made it indispensable to Marine and Army units operating in terrain where larger artillery pieces could not be effectively employed. Sergeant McCullough survived 4 major amphibious assaults before returning home to Michigan in December 1945, his service record documenting participation in battles from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. He never forgot the sound that steel balls made when they struck human targets, a wet tearing noise that haunted his dreams for decades after the war ended. McCullough worked as a machinist in Detroit's automotive industry, applying precision manufacturing skills learned in the military to peacetime production. But he never spoke to his family about the effectiveness of the weapons he had operated in the Pacific. Japanese military historians writing after the war acknowledged that the tactical surprise achieved by American canister rounds contributed significantly to the failure of traditional assault tactics that had served the Imperial Army effectively in China and Southeast Asia. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, who survived the war and wrote extensively about Japanese military failures, identified the encounter with canister fire at Guadalcanal as a turning point that forced fundamental changes in infantry doctrine. The psychological impact on Japanese soldiers proved as significant as the physical casualties, with entire units losing confidence in their ability to overcome American defensive positions through spiritual determination alone. Private Miller completed his military service in April 1946, having participated in 5 amphibious operations where his 37mm gun crew engaged enemy forces with canister ammunition. His loading speed and reliability under fire earned commendations from 3 different battery commanders, though Miller himself considered his role unremarkable compared to the Marines who fought with rifles and bayonets. He used the GI Bill to attend college in Ohio, becoming a high school mathematics teacher who occasionally mentioned his military service, but never described the specific nature of his combat duties. The tactical lessons learned from canister ammunition employment influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War period, with similar anti-personnel rounds developed for larger artillery systems. The 75mm pack howitzer received canister rounds containing 260 steel balls, while the 105mm howitzer employed canister rounds with 350 projectiles, with enemy commanders increasingly relying on defensive tactics that avoided exposing large numbers of troops to concentrated American firepower. Sergeant McCullough wrote to his family in Michigan describing the effectiveness of his weapon, though military censors removed specific details about ammunition types and casualty figures before allowing the letter to be mailed. His account focused on the psychological impact of the engagement, noting how Japanese soldiers who had seemed superhuman in their fanatical courage suddenly appeared vulnerable when faced with weapons they could not overcome through spiritual strength alone. The myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat had been shattered by American industrial capability and tactical innovation. Medical personnel treating wounded Marines reported significant improvements in morale following the successful defense against the Banzai charge, with soldiers expressing greater confidence in their ability to survive future engagements. The knowledge that American weapons could stop even the most determined enemy assault provided psychological benefits that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Marine casualties from hand-to-hand combat decreased substantially as fewer Japanese soldiers reached American positions during subsequent attacks. Production of canister ammunition increased dramatically throughout 1943 as Pacific Theater commanders requested additional supplies for upcoming amphibious operations. The Rock Island Arsenal expanded its manufacturing capacity specifically to meet demand for 37mm canister rounds, with quality control procedures ensuring that each steel ball met precise specifications for weight and diameter. By December 1943, American forces in the Pacific possessed over 50,000 canister rounds distributed among anti-tank gun units from New Guinea to the Aleutian Islands. Training programs for replacement personnel emphasized the importance of canister ammunition in defensive operations, with new Marine recruits spending additional hours learning to load and fire the specialized rounds under simulated combat conditions. Gunnery sergeants who had participated in the Guadalcanal fighting became instructors at artillery schools, passing on hard-won knowledge about optimal engagement ranges and target selection criteria that could maximize the weapon's devastating effectiveness. The tactical revolution represented by canister ammunition extended beyond its immediate battlefield applications, influencing American weapons development programs throughout the remainder of the war. Ordnance specialists began designing similar anti-personnel rounds for other artillery systems, creating a family of weapons specifically intended to counter Japanese human wave tactics. The success of the 37mm canister round proved that innovative ammunition design could multiply the effectiveness of existing weapons without requiring completely new manufacturing programs or extensive retraining of personnel. Japanese military leaders gradually abandoned the Banzai charge as a primary tactical doctrine, recognizing that American firepower had evolved beyond their ability to overcome through traditional methods. The transformation of warfare in the Pacific Theater accelerated as both sides adapted to new realities, but the psychological impact of that first encounter between Japanese courage and American steel balls would influence tactical thinking for the remainder of the conflict. Captain Hightower returned to San Diego in March 1945, carrying with him the Silver Star he had earned for his innovative use of anti-tank weapons against Japanese infantry on Guadalcanal. The modest decoration seemed inadequate recognition for tactiles for engaging massed infantry formations. These weapons proved effective in Korea and Vietnam, where American forces again faced enemy tactics, emphasizing human wave assaults in close-range combat. General Hyakutake died in Japanese custody in 1947 while awaiting trial for war crimes, his military career ending in disgrace after a series of tactical failures that cost the Imperial Army tens of thousands of casualties. His memoirs, discovered years later, revealed deep regret about his decision to employ Banzai tactics against American positions equipped with weapons his intelligence staff had failed to identify. Hyakutake blamed Japanese military culture for emphasizing spiritual factors over material considerations, arguing that realistic assessment of enemy capabilities might have prevented the disasters that befell his forces. The 37mm gun success story extended beyond its wartime service, with many weapons remaining in American inventory through the 1960s. National Guard units employed them for training purposes, teaching new generations of artillerymen the fundamentals of direct fire, gunnery using weapons proven in combat. Several guns were transferred to allied nations under military assistance programs, serving with distinction in conflicts from the Korean War to various Cold War proxy battles, where their mobility and reliability proved valuable assets. Museum displays throughout the United States preserve examples of the M3 anti-tank gun and its canister ammunition, though few visitors understand the weapon's significance in changing the tactical balance of Pacific warfare. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas maintains a working demonstration model that fires practice rounds to show visitors how the canister system operated, though safety regulations prevent the use of actual steel balls in these presentations. Educational materials explain the weapon's dual role, but focus primarily on its anti-tank capabilities rather than its devastating effectiveness against human targets. Manufacturing records preserved at the Rock Island Arsenal document the precision required to produce effective canister rounds, with quality control procedures ensuring that each steel ball met tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The production process required specialized machinery and skilled workers, representing a significant investment in manufacturing capability that reflected American industrial superiority over Japanese war production. By 1944, American factories were producing canister ammunition faster than combat units could expend it, creating strategic reserves that ensured adequate supplies for future operations. The psychological impact of canister weapons extended beyond their immediate tactical effects, influencing Japanese strategic planning throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Intelligence reports captured after Japan's surrender revealed extensive discussions among military leaders about countering American anti-personnel artillery, with proposed solutions ranging from dispersed assault tactics to the development of protective equipment for infantry units. None of these countermeasures proved practical given Japan's declining industrial capacity and the increasing sophistication of American defensive systems. Captain Hightower's innovation represented a broader pattern of American tactical adaptation during the Pacific War, where frontline personnel modified existing weapons and procedures to meet specific combat requirements. Similar innovations occurred throughout the theater, from the development of napalm for jungle warfare to the employment of flamethrowers against fortified positions. The willingness of American commanders to experiment with new techniques and abandon traditional doctrine when circumstances demanded change provided significant advantages over enemies who remained bound by rigid tactical systems. The legacy of the 37mm canister round extends beyond its immediate military applications, representing the triumph of industrial innovation and tactical flexibility over traditional military virtues of courage and spiritual determination. The weapon that began as a tank killer evolved into one of the most effective anti-personnel systems of World War II, proving that creativity and adaptation could multiply the effectiveness of existing military hardware without requiring massive investments in new development programs. In the end, it was not superior numbers or fanatic devotion that determined victory in the Pacific, but the ability to transform defensive necessity into offensive advantage through the careful application of American industrial capability and tactical ingenuity.